Hello and welcome to the lesson. Today we are going to start a new topic known as appointment of receivers of revenue. This topic has 4 subtopics. Number 1, definition and appointment of receivers of revenue. Number 2, the role of accounting officers in management of receivers of revenue. Number 3, procedure for revenue classification and estimating revenues. Number 4, accounting procedure for the receivers of revenue. There are 4 areas we will cover in the topic appointment of receivers of revenue. We'll begin with the definition of receivers of revenue. Definition of receivers of revenue. Now, candidates, a receiver of revenue means any officer appointed by the Treasury for the collection and accounting of items of revenue. I repeat, a receiver of revenue means any officer appointed by the National Treasury. A receiver of revenue, number 1, is any officer that is appointed by the National Treasury. For what purpose? For the collection and accounting. For the collection and accounting of items of revenue. And candidates, the accounting officer, or say receivers of revenue, the receiver of revenue, a receiver, we are defining receiver of revenue. Receiver, definition of receiver of revenue. Definition of receiver of revenue. Now, according to the Public Finance Management Act, Section 75, the Public Finance Management Act, Section 75, a receiver of revenue in relation to the national government, a receiver of revenue, I repeat, according to Public Finance Management Act, Section 75, a receiver of revenue according to the national government. Why do I say national government? Because there is a receiver according to the county government. As for the national government, a receiver of revenue means a person that is designated to be a receiver of revenue under this section, Section 75 of the Public Finance Management Act. All right? The law is very clear. All right? Designation of receivers and the collectors of national government. So we are now moving on to appointment. This is now appointment or designation. We've defined receiver of revenue. We are now on appointment of revenue. And this appointment is in line with the Public Finance Management Act, Section 75. So, candidates, the Cabinet Secretary, the Act states, shall in writing designate persons as receivers of national government revenue under Article 209 of the Constitution. Under Article 209 of the Constitution, which deals with the, under Part 3, the revenue raising powers and the public debt. Power to impose taxes and charges, Article 209, I read in part, only the national government may impose income tax, value-added tax, customs duties, and other duties on import and export goods, and also excise tax. Then it goes ahead to read, an act of parliament may authorize the national government to impose any other tax or duty except a tax specified in Clause 3A and B. Clause 3A and B is in relation to the county government, that is property rates and entertainment rates, but Part C, that is Clause C. Clause C reads any other tax that is authorized to impose by an act of parliament. So the cabinet secretary shall in writing designate or appoint persons as receivers of national government revenue in accordance with the Article 209 of the Constitution. And this is a person who shall be responsible for receiving and accounting for such national government revenue provided in any law or in regulations, as the cabinet secretary may specify in the letter of appointment. So these persons may be appointed we are on appointment by the cabinet secretary. This is the Public Finance Management Act. The Constitution has delegated that power to appoint receivers of revenue and to the Parliament, which came up with an Act of Parliament, which is known as the Public Finance Management Act, which in Section 75 states that these receiver of revenue may be designated or appointed by the Cabinet Secretary, and it has to be in writing, in line with the Article 209, which deals with the powers to impose taxes and charges. So the Act may also give the Cabinet Secretary the leeway to draft regulations under the subsidiary legislation on how this appointment may be done, and also the appointment letter. There will also be regulations that may be specified in the role or the work of the receiver of revenue in the letter of appointment. B, a receiver of revenue, a receiver of national government revenue candidates is responsible to the Cabinet Secretary for the collection of revenue for which he or she is responsible, and such revenue shall be separately accounted for in accordance with Article 206 and Article 209. I just read Article 209. Article 206 of the Constitution is all about the consolidated fund and other public funds. All right? So that is appointment and accounting. Part B, I've talked about accounting. So the receiver of revenue is required to also account. Number one, the receiver of revenue is accountable to the Cabinet Secretary for the collection of revenue for which he is responsible for, and shall separately account for that revenue. Separately account for the revenue. So that is the definition of receiver of revenue of the national government. Receiver of revenue in relation to the national government. How about the receiver of revenue in relation to the county government? Receiver of revenue, the receiver of revenue in relation to county, receiver of revenue in relation to the county government. Now here candidates, the CEC member of finance, the county executive committee member, the CEC member of finance, just like the cabinet secretary of national treasury, shall in writing designate persons to be responsible for collecting, receiving, and accounting for such county government revenue as the county executive committee member for finance may specify in the letter of designation. The letter of designation. Now, as for the county government, it is the responsibility of the CEC member of finance to designate persons responsible for number 1, collection, number 2, receiving and accounting of county government revenue. And the roles or responsibility of such a person should be clearly specified in the letters of designation. And a receiver of county government revenue is responsible to the county executive committee member for finance for ensuring that revenue for which the receiver is responsible is collected and recovered and is accounted for appropriately. Do you understand? That is in line with the PFM Act, Section 157. Section 157 of the Public Finance Management Act. Do you understand? Now, moving on to the receiver of revenue in Section 75 of the Public Finance Management Act, a receiver of revenue designated by the Cabinet Secretary under this section is responsible for the collection of and the accounting for such items of revenue as the Cabinet Secretary may specify. And we also said here that the letter of designation of receiver of revenue indicates his or her responsibilities and the manner in which he or she may delegate the duties of collection of revenue to officers under him or her or another national government entity. So the Cabinet Secretary may designate the responsibility to a person to collect revenue on behalf of the national government, but the person responsible for collecting the revenue for the national government may delegate such duties to another government entity. However, the receiver of revenue for loans and grant funds is the principal secretary to the National Treasury. And the Cabinet Secretary should specify such items of revenue in the designation letter. It's a very important point. I've just noted there that the receiver of revenue of loans and grants, receiver of revenue of loans and grant fund is the principal secretary, of the National Treasury. Receiver of revenue of loans and grant fund is the principal secretary, the National Treasury. And the Cabinet Secretary should specify such items of revenue in the designation letter. The receiver of revenue of loans and grant funds is the principal secretary, National Treasury. All right? So candidates, I just stated that the receiver of revenue, who is appointed by the Cabinet Secretary, may as well delegate the responsibilities to another public officer. A receiver of national government revenue may authorize a public officer employed by the national government or any of its entities to be a collector of revenue for the national government and remit it to the receiver. So the Cabinet Secretary may designate the responsibility of collecting revenue for the national government to a receiver of revenue. And we've defined a receiver of revenue as any officer appointed by the National Treasury for the collection and accounting of items of revenue. This receiver who is appointed or designated by the National Treasury or the Cabinet Secretary may delegate that responsibility to another government officer or public officer employed by the national government. Now, when that happens, the public officer employed by the national government or any of its entities, when such is appointed to be a collector of revenue for the national government, then the items of revenue collected must be remitted to the receiver of revenue. And any public officer other than a receiver or collector of revenue for national government who collects revenue for the national government should, not later than 3 days after receiving it, deliver the revenue to the receiver of revenue for the national government. The receiver, that one I know you've understood. The receiver, whom we've defined here, we've said may delegate his responsibilities or her responsibilities to a public officer employed by the national government. So this public officer working under delegated responsibilities from the receiver is required to do what? To submit any revenue received within a period of 3 days to the receiver. And another important point to note is that a receiver of revenue of the national government should provide monthly statements to the National Treasury and the Commission on Revenue Allocation. A receiver of revenue of the national government is required to provide monthly statements to the National Treasury and the Commission on Revenue Allocation. Let's move on. We are discussing receivers of revenue. The Kenya Revenue Authority is the collector of the national government revenue. The Kenya Revenue Authority is what? Is the collector of national government revenue. The Kenya Revenue Authority is the collector of national government revenue. But before I mention anything here in relation to Kenya Revenue Authority, let me come back to the receiver of revenue of the national government. We say that a receiver of national government may delegate his or her responsibility to a public officer of the national government. Likewise, candidates, a receiver of revenue for the county government may authorize a public officer employed by that county government or any of its entities to be a collector of revenue for the purpose of collecting revenue for that county government and remitting it to the receiver. Just the same way the national government collector may delegate his or her responsibilities to another government, national government public officer. The same may apply to the national government. The receiver of the national government may as well delegate his or her responsibilities to another person or an employee of the county government and any other public officer other than the receiver of revenue or collector of revenue for a county government who collects revenue for that government should not later than 3 days after receiving the revenue deliver the revenue to the receiver or collector of revenue for that county government. Just the same way we stated about the national government. It also applies to the county government. Then here, the the Kenya Revenue Authority is the collector of the national government, is a collector of national government revenue. All right? The Kenya Revenue Authority is the collector of the Kenya government revenue. You understand? Yes, you do. So the Kenya Revenue Authority may be appointed collector. The County Executive Committee member for finance may also authorize the Kenya Revenue Authority or appoint a collection agent to be a collector of county government revenue for the purpose of collection of revenue. So the Kenya Revenue Authority is the collector of the national government, but I'm also saying that the county government may appoint the Kenya Revenue Authority to be the collector of revenue for the national government. And there could be terms and conditions that may be agreed upon in writing in accordance with the regulations that are developed by the Cabinet Secretary. So that's all, candidates, as far as the appointment of receivers of revenue is concerned. We, in this lesson, defined the receiver of revenue or collector of revenue. We've seen or outlined the receivers of revenue for both the national government and the county government. Thank you for attending the lesson. In our next session, we are going to continue with the topic appointment of receivers of revenue, and we will proceed to the second subtopic, which is the role of county accounting officers, the role of accounting officers in management of receivers of revenue, the role of accounting officers in management of receivers of revenue. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.